QSO Today, episode 469, George Fremin K5TR. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast and now the QSO Today Academy coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. We have two new listener sponsors this week. Mike Tindor, AA8IA, $100 annual listener sponsor. Mike is a frequent transcription sponsor and contributor to the QSO Today podcast. We also have Matthew Kaufman, KN60TW, is now a $10 monthly listener sponsor. My thanks to both of you for helping to support the QSO Today podcast and the QSO Today Academy. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. The QSO Today Academy will open its doors on October 12, 2023 at 1800 PDT, where I will be making an introduction to the QSO Today Academy and demonstrating the resources that we've been building to supplement the great efforts that many hams are making to ham radio education. This event will open to everyone. It will have an open networking lounges before and after the presentation. More on this presentation at the QSO Today Academy website. Click on the banner in this show notes page. By the way, if you also have a presentation that you would like to make at a monthly meeting of the QSO Today Academy, please use the form banner on the show notes page. Today's podcast is a reprise of my interview with George Fremin K5TR in April of 2017. George is a world-class contester and DXer with years of experience building and maintaining first-class multi-operator contest stations. George gives some important advice on tower safety and working on antenna towers. We also touch on the flow state that is achievable during intense contesting rounds in this QSO Today. K5TR, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, George?
4Z1UG, K5TR. Hello.
Good morning, George. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
For me, it started probably when the neighbor across the street's father got a CB radio and the CB radio craze of the mid-'70s in his truck. And I was fascinated by, we would go sit in the truck and listen to the nutty things going on the CB radio. And I was fascinated by that. And I started bugging my father to, give me a CB radio. And my father had an old Hallicrafter's S40A in the house that he had from the late 40s, early 50s, when he turns out was interested in ham radio. And so we hooked that up, and he did get me he got me a pair of walkie-talkies that had 3 channels, and so I sort of got to play with that, and I actually made a few contacts, with 100 milliwatts or whatever, and I could listen to myself on the S40A, which was kind of cool. But that's really how it started, was because of the CB craze. My father, because of his interest in ham radio, was smart enough to realize that if we really wanted to do radio, that I should do some real radio and not that silly CB radio stuff. And there was a local ham radio class, and so he got me signed up.
How old were you?
I was 12 years old when I think this all started.
And how old were you when you got your first license?
I got licensed at the age of 13.
What year was that? It
was in 1976. I got my license in September of 1976.
And what was your call sign?
Well, my call sign, I got my license in the mail. I didn't have a way to transmit, and And in fact, when I was looking at the license manual, I always thought I was using the old ancient license manual from Native Valerial, and I thought, I'd build one of these tube things that they had in there with crystals. But I think by 76 or so, things had sort of progressed beyond that technology a little bit. But my original call sign was WN5 Victor Zulu Lima, WN5VZL. And it got almost exactly a month after getting that call. I never got on the air with that call. And a month after getting that call, I got another letter from the FCC in the mail, which, I got home from school and I was like, uh-oh, what's this? I haven't even done anything. But I opened it and it said, your previous license has been superseded by this one. And it had the call sign WB5VZL. And I didn't understand why they had done that. But it turns out that the reason they had done that is to sort of facilitate the instant upgrading stuff that was going to come along in a year or so. So they just upgraded all the WN5s to WB5s.
What kind of license was that? Was that still a novice license?
It was still a novice license, so I didn't take any tests. I just got a new call sign. So I was never on the air as WN5VZL. And I don't even think I have managed to find that copy of that WN5 license anywhere. I probably don't even have that one that's superseded, but maybe if I looked around.
So you have a novice license, WB5VZL, and a Hallicrafters S40A. So where did you go after that?
Well, we lived in Waco, Texas at the time, and we ended up moving. My father ran a retail stereo store, and he opened up another location in a town about 35 miles away. And so we were living in a house that we were renting in Waco. We moved in September, late September maybe, or in mid-October. We moved to Temple, Texas, 35 miles away, into an apartment. And I still didn't have a radio. I kept bugging him. I wanted to get on the radio, and he was actually very nice about it. He had actually he remembered the code, and he passed his code test a month before I did, and as a result, he passed his written test a month before I did. And so he actually got a call sign. He's Whiskey. He still has a license. He has not operated much. He's Whiskey Bravo 5 Uniform Kilo Uniform. And anyway, for Christmas he bought me a TS 520, brand new, which was very nice. When I look back at what that cost, in today's dollars, that's pretty amazing. But I got a TS 520. We still lived in an apartment. We put a 10 and 15 meter dipole sort of strung down the hall right at the ceiling level, and I could take a piece of coax out and attach it to the center insulator, screw it in, and be on the air that way. A ground floor apartment. And he also bought a slinky dipole, and believe it or not, I operated a 40 meter CW with a slinky dipole in my room that was physically 10 feet long. And I even worked Alaska.
So that shows you can work just about anything with anything if you have the determination.
Yeah, I worked Japan. There was a JA that used to get on 15 meters and work novices. He would be on sideband, and he would call CQ in the novice band, and he would work guys split mode. And I worked him from the apartment with my 15 meter dipole, at 8 feet high.
Hardly NVIS at that point.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Well, that's really cool. So the Kenwood TS520 is a great rig. I actually have one behind me in my ham shack that I've had for over 30 years. It's a great radio. So what did you go on to do with the TS520? Did you stay in the apartment for a while, or did you have a chance to put it on a bigger antenna system?
Well, we were in the apartment for I actually don't know how long I was in the apartment. I think maybe close to a year, maybe longer. I'm not exactly sure. I probably could figure it out. We eventually moved to a house. He bought a house, and we moved to a house. And so then I was able to put up a few antennas. He also, I guess within a year of moving to the house, he agreed to put up a tower. And so for the Christmas, I got given some tower sections, and then I had to buy a few more tower sections. And we put up 40 feet of 25G, and I put CB 5/8 wave CB vertical on the top of it, and strung a 40-meter sloping dipole off of it that also had it was sort of a fan dipole, if you will. It had 40 meters and then 20 meters hanging off of it, and I could get on 10, 15 with the 40-meter dipole. I could get on 15 and 40 and 20, and that worked really well for a long time. And then eventually a local guy gave me a 2-element quad that I put up on top of the tower.
And when did you upgrade?
When we were still living in the apartment, I upgraded to technician. One of the problems I had going, almost 6 months or whatever it is, 5 months, 4 months, without actually making any contacts. I was never very good at the Morse code. I don't know if it was because I wasn't practicing or whatever, but I just was never very great at it. And by the time I got a radio, it took me a little while before I, managed to make more than make some real contacts. It was somewhat painful for me, kind of getting back up to speed and being able to actually make contacts on the radio. So I upgraded to technician first, and then I did manage to get an old 2-meter radio, crystal controlled 2-meter radio, so I could talk to some of the locals. And so I did that, and then eventually I upgraded to general, and then advanced, and then all the way to extra. It took a few years, but I was still a technician when we moved to the house, but I quickly upgraded to general at the house. And that would have been, 1978 probably.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Yeah, I would say I think that it did, but probably not in the way that I don't know if it's in positive ways or not. I will confess that amateur radio has been a huge part of my life. I've never not been active, and it has shaped a lot of decisions. I don't know if some of them have been the best decisions, but it certainly made me very happy. So as far as education, I had a friend who was a ham radio operator. He went and got a electrical engineering degree, and I sort of thought, well, maybe I'll do that. But I ended up not doing that. I have a bachelor's degree in history, and I went to the I went to a couple of years of junior college in Temple, and then I went to the University of Texas in Austin. I was born in Austin and spent some years there, and my mother lived there. So I don't think that I necessarily Austin for that. Although there was a contest operator station that was near Austin that I had operated at, and so that was certainly one of my choices, was to be near that. Although that ended up not working out so well because of some changes in his life. The University of Texas Amateur Radio Club had towers and radios, and so that was a way for me to get on the radio. And so that had a little bit to do with it. But mainly, I would say that the real choices that I made is while I was going to school, I was also operating from a station in Dallas, Texas, which is 200 miles away. And I was doing that when I was in Temple. It's closer, only 150 miles, 125 miles. But I made some choices about class schedules based on being able to go for the weekend to operate radio contests, and eventually I actually decided on some job choices based on the fact that it gave me flexibility to operate radio contests. I guess I got the amateur code backwards and figured out that job and things like that should never interfere with ham radio.
And they didn't.
No, they didn't. I made sure of that because I've made a lot of choices all along the way to do that. I will say that my associations with ham radio operators, one of them was that I got a job with N5TR, although that's not the reason that I chose the call sign K5TR, but I had used N5TR on the air, and I thought, well, that's a great call sign. And so when K5TR was available, I picked it. But I ended up getting a job with K5TR in his consulting business, where he was a consultant in the energy industry, and I worked. He wanted to build some computers, and so that really has led me down the path of my current career, which is system administrator, all from doing essentially desktop support and then server support for him. And the reason that I got that job in the first place was because I knew him because we were ham radio operators. So I guess, in that sense, from a networking sense, ham radio has been good.
Based upon my research and what I found about you online is that you're a world-class contester in DXer. How did that start for you?
When I first got on the air in Temple, quickly ran across some of the locals and a couple of people that were my age or slightly older, and they were interested in doing some field day efforts and doing a little more serious field day effort than actually trying to go out and make a score, not just going out to make a few contacts and eat barbecue. And so they had split off sort of from the local radio club to go off and do these field day efforts. And so I got hooked up with them. The first field day, I didn't actually make any contacts with them. I took my radio, but it didn't have a CW filter in it at the time, and they were not very interested in it. The next year, though, I went and I actually operated. In fact, this guy, WB5KTD, sat down next to me and he coached me through making contacts for the first hour, and then the second hour I was pretty much on my own. And so I'd say that those field day efforts really, over the years, those first 3 or 4 field day efforts are the ones that really spurred me into wanting to do other things. Although when we still lived in the apartment, and maybe even before the second field day, when we still lived in the apartment, I didn't have very many QST magazines, but I had one that had the 10-meter contest results in it from the previous year. So it was probably a 1975 10-meter contest results, and maybe even 1974. And I think that issue was probably written by Jim Kane, K1TN. All I remember is that for whatever reason, those results encouraged me. I would read them and I'd go, I want to get on in the 10-meter contest. And I could do it as a novice. And so I actually did get on in the 10-meter contest from the apartment. I made 22 contacts. So that was my first real contest. That was even before making any contacts at field day. So I'd say that QST results article had maybe more to do with it than anything else. But once I actually started making contacts, real contacts with real antennas or something at field day, it was pretty cool.
What was the N5AU superstation in Rockwall County, Texas?
So Gordon Fogg, N5AU, built a station in 1980. I think they put that station up at that location. He'd had a previous station in a smaller location, but he bought 20 acres and built a house east of Dallas. And put up, originally I think they put up about 26 towers over the summer in 1981. And he wanted to do multi contesting, multi-operator, multi-transmitter contesting. And he built up this big multi station. Purpose-built the room in the house to do the multi, and they put up, I think they put up 26 towers. Some of them were not very tall. Lots of fixed antennas. I went and operated, the first contest I operated from there was actually the following year. They were most interested in the CQ Worldwide sideband contest. I think that was Gordon's primary interest was that particular contest. And I went, the first contest I operated from there was the 1982 CQWW sideband contest, and I operated on 15 meters with K5ZD. We can go into more detail about this station, I guess. It was a huge place, and of course, in the 80s, I don't know if there was anything quite like it in a lot of ways anywhere in the world. There were 26 towers, antennas, monobanders for all the bands, vertical array for 80, and a single vertical for 160. And after operating there in 82, suggested to K5ZD that, hey, maybe I could operate some other contests here, and I was able to operate. I think the next contest I probably went for the ARRL sideband contest. I'm not much of a code op still, but I went for the sideband contest, the ARRL DX contest, and then I actually operated the radio sport contest, I think, in the summer of '83 as a single op.
From the same station, from N5AU.
From N5AU. And then after that, I just pretty much was there for every, certainly any sideband DX contests, and then also for CW contests, and then I would go up and just spend the weekend. We did a lot of miscellaneous contests. I started doing the sweepstakes contest, I think. I'd have to go look at my list. I have a list of all my sweepstakes contest efforts. I think I did in what year? 83 maybe, or 84 was the first time I operated sweepstakes from there. I operated at that station from 1982 until 1992, and did lots of different contests. And I spent many weekends there working on antennas and working on things inside and working on switching and whatever needed to get fixed.
What did you learn from N5AU from your 10 years there?
Well, so since we were doing these multi-ops, I got exposed probably to a lot of things. I got to learn from some of the best people out there in the world of contesting. Some of the operators that were there were K5ZD, N5RZ, N5KO, K5MM, KM5X, N5CR, N5TR, and probably forgetting people. K5MR would sometimes come and operate. And all of these guys have been doing some of this stuff for a long time and had lots of skill. So I got to learn a lot of things from each one of those people. In addition to that, from N5AU and N5RZ and K5ZD to some extent, although he wasn't there the whole time, I learned all about how to put all this stuff together. As we started working on the station and trying to improve it, we moved things around and we stacked tower and we reconfigured things. We took down some of the towers. We trimmed it down from 26 towers down to like 18 towers or 20 towers, mainly by taking towers down and putting them up on top of other towers and making them taller and moving antennas around and reconfiguring stuff. Because basically we kept the things that worked and tried to improve the things that didn't work so well with the original station design. And so I learned a lot about antennas. One of the interesting things is we had a lot of antennas. So the band that I mostly operated on was 15 meters. When we did the multis, I was one of the 15-meter operators always. And on 15 meters, we had the station such that finally pretty much the final configuration on 15 meters was, and I think it had the most antennas. One of the things was very few rotators, lots of fixed antennas. And then the other trick was to make the fixed antenna be the best antenna you could make it for that particular direction. So on 15 meters, we had an antenna switch, and there was a button for Europe, and there was a button for South America, and there was a button for Japan. And I added an antenna, so there was a button for the South Pacific. There was a button for a rotary antenna. And eventually we had two rotary antennas. So you didn't have to do much. You pointed the rotary antenna in the morning at Africa and in the afternoon typically, out to the South Pacific. And then the rest of the time you punched buttons, because even though you had a rotary antenna, say at 175 feet, the best antenna for Japan was the button that said Japan, and the best antenna for Europe was the button that said Europe. And so you didn't have to worry that rotary antenna was going to be better. A lot of times at a contest station, it's like, I need to rotate the antenna. It's like, no, you just push the button here, because there's no point in rotating that antenna, because we'd operated enough contests that we knew, sort of what works and what doesn't work, and so you learn these things. So I learned a lot at that station as a result of that. I learned a lot about antenna heights in the state of Texas. at a location that has relatively flat ground. So I learned a fair amount about station building, I would say. So it was a great experience, and being able to be around all these people that operating. And then as the years went by, I was sort of organizing the multis, and I was, I don't know, for 3, 4, 5 years maybe. In the late '80s, in the early '90s, I was rounding everybody up. We didn't actually have very many radios. There was an amplifier for every band. Actually, I guess there was really only one amplifier for every band. But the way we did multi is we had to set up 2 stations. So when we invite people, it's like, hey, can you bring your amplifier and your radio? We had some radios for a while, but then as radios got better than the ones we had, people started bringing their TS 930s or whatever, and so I would have to coordinate that, and the radios and the amplifiers would trickle in even all the way up to the start of the contest, and you had to integrate that before the contest started. It was quite a production for like CQ Worldwide to actually, get it so we had two positions on 40 through 10 meters, and then single radios on 80 and 160, plus amplifiers for all the second stations. So it was quite a little production to pull all that off. But as a result, I got to invite people over the years. Either I invited or my friends, would invite people that either we knew or people that we admired. It's like, hey, you want to come operate with us? And so I got to operate with some people from different parts of the country that came and operated with us, and that was very cool.
You were involved in the construction and operation of W5KFT contest station. What did you do there, and what did you learn?
So W5KFT lived in Lubbock, Texas. Texas is a pretty big state, and Lubbock's, I don't know, from where I live here in Austin, where I was living at the time in the early 90s. Lubbock is like a 6-hour drive or something. Anyway, they had a family ranch about an hour and a half drive west of Austin on the edge of a large lake. And he wanted to build a station there. He was getting tired of all the line noise and various other limiting issues of his city lot in Lubbock. I think the line noise was the worst of it. He was very interested in 80 meters, 80 meter DXing, and he had done some contesting. And W5KFT was looking for somebody to help him with that because he really didn't know what he wanted to do. And he talked to my friend Ralph in N5RZ, who at the time lived in Midland, Texas, which is 5 hours from here and closer to Lubbock, and said, hey, could you help me do this? And N5RZ said, I don't really have time to do that, but you should call George. So I went out and visited, and we got along. And we talked about what we would do there. Basically, I would help build the place and make suggestions about designing it for contest operating and DXing. And in return, I'd get to operate. And one of the things that I wanted to do that I hadn't really been able to do at N5AU was do a lot more single operator contests. And so this was one of the ways to do that at a time when I didn't have not only could I not afford a station, but I didn't have a place to build one. In fact, I will tell you that my career choice had been after I graduated, actually before I graduated from college with my history degree, I got a job driving the University of Texas shuttle bus. We had a shuttle bus. The University of Texas has a shuttle bus system for the 50,000 students plus faculty. And it had like 12 routes and carried a huge number of people every day, something like 50,000 rides a day, which is, something like half the students riding the bus every day. And so I got a job doing that because it had flexible hours and it was very cool. It was actually a very fun job in lots of ways, but it didn't produce a lot of income. So I didn't have the means for buying my own station. So this was a way for me to get the keys to the sports car or the race car, much like the N5AU, except that instead of a 4-hour drive, one way. It turns into an hour and a half or an hour and a quarter drive one way, which was much, much preferable by the early 90s, because I'd been driving to N5AU for years and years and years, and I was wearing out the interstate between Austin and Rockwall. So anyway, we built the station. I got to make lots of suggestions. Brian at W5KFT rounded up lots of hardware and tower, and he wheeled and dealed in the used radio antenna market, and so he got all kinds of things. He enjoyed doing that. He sort of developed a little business, I think, doing all that, buying and selling radio equipment. So we had lots of different things kind of pass through the shack over the years, radio and amplifier wise. But he rounded up all the stuff, and we started building a station. And I made suggestions about what I thought would work, and I got to build that station. I mean, I stacked all the tower and I put all the antennas up. I did all the tower work in the air. Brian and his girlfriend at the time built a lot of antennas, and I got to do lots and lots of wiring. I spent many, many weekends or days out there working on that station as if it were my own. So that was a great experience, because I got more hands-on experience from the ground up doing the station. So that was very interesting.
And now this mid-show break. The future of podcasting and the QSO Today podcast is listener sponsorship. It keeps us lean and focused on providing you the best ham radio interviews since 2014. You can keep the QSO Today podcast commercial and sponsor-free by becoming a listener sponsor yourself. For $10 a month, or save 20% at $100 per year, you can become a listener sponsor. I am now recording the QSO Today podcast as video interviews that are available only as a benefit to listener sponsors through our QSO Today community website. As I develop the sponsorship tier, I will add bonus content for listener sponsors. Listener sponsors, not donors, are automatically members of the new QSO Today Academy. I am building the Academy website to include access to our Sequel I/O networking lounges all of the time, and Academy resources including over 400 previous Expo presentations with Q&A, and additional helpful ham radio educational resources. The benefit of listener sponsorship as an alternative to commercial sponsorship is that commercial sponsors influence the content and comments in the podcast. Listener sponsorship allows a greater degree of freedom to discuss any ham radio subject without commercial consequence. I have eliminated all commercials in the QSO Today podcast from episode 445, with the exception of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, as I think that this is a serious asset to a well-rounded ham radio education. I am not using Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon, but my own system for managing the community that could form out of the podcast. I direct you to the sponsorship section of the show notes pages beginning with the episode 444, where I list all of the contributors to the podcast since 2014, including sponsors, donors, and hams who have paid for transcriptions. If sponsorship is not your interest, then you can make any size donation to the podcast by clicking on the donation button on the QSO Today podcast website at qsotoday.com. There is a slider that you can use to adjust the amount of your donation. If you want to make your donation monthly, click on the recurring donation box. It is the recurring donations and the listener sponsorships that keep the lights burning here. Finally, you don't have to contribute anything to listen to the QSO Today podcast. You can use my Amazon affiliate link before shopping at Amazon by clicking on it on the right side of the show notes page. This will signal Amazon to send us a small percentage of what you purchase. This is the most painless way to ensure that the QSO Today project will be here next week. I want to thank everyone who has contributed and will contribute to my effort to create this oral history of amateur radio since 2014. It will eventually all be in the public domain for hams in the future to enjoy. Be sure to become a listener sponsor or make a donation today. And now we return to our QSO Today. If you were to give some safety advice to new hams or hams that want to get into doing their own tower work, What kind of safety advice would you give?
When I got that first 40-foot tower, I think we used to rent a safety belt from the local tool shop, which in retrospect scares me. In fact, I think back on that belt and I go, man, that's a terrible idea. It was some ancient lineman's belt. Although it wasn't as bad as some people's belts I've seen over the years, cracked leather or whatever. That was better than that. But I would say that you should buy your own safety equipment. By the time I was at N5AU and I started doing some tower work, he had a belt there, but I decided I wanted to buy my own. So I bought in 1985 or 80, I guess in 1986, I actually bought a climbing belt, safety belt, lineman's belt at the time.
A new one.
I brought a brand new one.
Right.
So I knew its history, and I bought a really good one, a Klein Deluxe lineman's belt, and from the local electrical supply place, and I was very happy with it. Although when I first got it, it was the wrong size, and I remember calling Klein Tool, and this guy answers his phone. I got like a receptionist, and she said, "Oh, how can I help you?" And I said, "Well, I have a question about a climbing belt that I bought." Blah blah blah. She said, "Hold on," and then this next guy on the phone was like, "This is Bob Klein or something," and I'm like, "Okay, I guess I'm talking to the right guy." So I ended up actually getting he swapped it out for me for a different size because he said, "No, if it doesn't fit right, it's not going to be comfortable." So anyway, I had that belt for a long time, but I've since moved on to the full body arrest harness. I would say that the things that I did over the years, I did some things that were probably stupid, and of course, some of it was things that we all did. Everybody that I know did, free climbing up the tower to pretty high, like 100 feet or more before ever belting off, things like that. By the time I was building this station, I had a full body arrest harness, and I am never not connected to the tower. There is no point now. Once I'm basically above the point where the fall arrest lanyards, will stop me from hitting the ground, which is about 8 or 9 feet, 10 feet, I'm connected to the tower. So even if I let go, I'm only going to fall the length of the fall arrest harness before, it catches me. And I had a close friend, as far as, well, I say close. I had a friend that I'd known for years who was about the same age as me, knew him on the radio. WD8 Italy X-ray Echo, WD8 IXE, and he had built the station, put up a tower in Dallas, and he fell from his tower. Nobody is quite sure why, but based on evidence, they think that because nobody was out there with him, which is probably a bad idea. Although I still do some climbing occasionally without people around, but I don't do any real serious work like that. He was probably climbing around a guy bracket. He had star brackets where they protrude out from the tower. They're kind of a pain to climb around. And he wasn't attached 100% of the time. And so you had to, when you went around those, you always had to unbelt. I would use the positioning lanyard sort of as fall arrest. Eventually I started doing that because going around a star bracket always unnerved me. It was kind of a pain. We had a couple of them on the towers at N5AU, and it was just they were never any fun to climb around. But anyway, that happened right before I started building my current station. And so I actually didn't do any tower work until after that happened, I didn't do any tower work until I bought a full arrest harness.
The reason I asked you the question is because I remember as a young guy, and when you're a young guy, young ham and stuff, you kind of trust, that whatever someone gives you, hey, put this on and climb the tower, that it's probably not okay, or it's probably marginally okay. And I remember free climbing and not thinking anything about it. So I'm glad you actually went into the detail that you went into, because as I say, when you're young and you're invincible, you don't really think about the issues of free climbing or going to the top of a commercial radio tower and then walking out on the side beam to the antenna that you want and sit down and then clip yourself on, which are things that stupidly, I remember doing. Take George's advice here and get a full body arrest harness.
Yes, I'm a big believer in that, but these days, and
well, we've all known people that have fallen and killed themselves, or even off the tower in their yard. It's awful and it's needless.
Yeah, it is. I mean, as long as if you're attached to the tower all the time with the proper stuff, there should be no reason for that to ever happen. I mean, and so I have 2 fall arrest lanyards. So this is the other thing I would do is I would get 2 fall arrest lanyards so that are one that has a Y connector in it, so that as you climb the tower, you can unclip one, but you're always connected. Because if you just have one, you're going to have to undo it every once in a while, and that's unacceptable.
Right. It slows you down a little bit, but
it's not bad.
Right.
At first it was kind of annoying, but now it's like, if you think about it, it's like, no, the alternative is a lot worse. And I guess the other thing is, it depends a lot on how much work you're going to do. The other thing is, I will say, is that there are people that really can't effectively work on a tower. And, if you're one of those people, then you probably have no business being up there in the first place. You're probably not going to get very much done. And what I mean by that is if you're not comfortable enough to be able to use both hands and lean out and do whatever it takes to do things and just normally work, you're probably not going to be very effective on the tower. And I can understand that, And there are days, there are days when, for whatever reason, I don't feel like doing it, and I won't do it. I'll go, I don't feel like doing this today, and I don't ever know why that is. I don't know, sometimes it's physical. I just don't feel quite up to it, but sometimes it's like it's just some other feeling. It's like I'm uncomfortable, and not because the tower's unsafe or anything, but you go out there and there've been days where I climb up the tower and you go, I'm not comfortable today doing this for whatever reason. And so when those days happen, I just don't do it. I go find something else to do. And I guess the other thing that I'll mention about tower work that, and especially hams, I think you can get into this situation, and this is scary too. So one of the things I do before I climb any tower, including my towers, is I go inspect things. I'll go look at all the guy points. I'll shake the guy wires. I'll make sure that all the turnbuckles have all the bolts in them, that they're not about to come loose. I've seen all kinds of things, and I'm like, I go look. I go physically, personally go walk to all of those points before I even get off the ground. But the other thing is, one of the things that happens, I know, with hams is, hey, there's a free tower over here, and that free tower may not be worth it. I remember driving, so I got told there was some tower that I was interested in. I was told it was the kind of tower I was interested in. And there was like 200 feet of it or 150 feet of it, and it would be free if we took it down. And in San Antonio, so one day I basically took off from work and I drove down there. And before I even got all the way to the tower, I could see from the distance that it wasn't what we thought it was, or what I was told it was. It was, instead of around 45, it was 25. But when I got to the tower and the landowner was there and he was like, yeah, I want to get rid of this. And I was looking at the tower, and this tower was scary. It was 25G. It was like 150 feet. It was next to an old business. It was near power lines. But the main thing is it was guided to these posts that were like 15 feet high. And the guys were kind of scary looking, and the posts were a little scary looking and all very rusty. And some of them were leaning. The tower wasn't straight. I told him, I said, he's like, what do you think? And I said, well, I'm not interested in this. And he goes, well, how could we take it down? And I said, well, if you didn't have that building over there, I would cut the guy wires. I said, I don't know how you're going to get this down because I'm not comfortable standing under this tower. In fact, I'm not going to take my eyes off this tower while we're standing here. It was that scary. It was like, I looked at it and I was like, I'm not comfortable being here. This is how scary your tower is. But even towers that don't look scary, they can be rusted at the concrete base. And so if you don't know these things, they can be absolutely dangerous to climb. And they may look okay, but they're not. And so you need to be really careful about taking down unknown stuff, no matter how free it is.
Well, it seems to me that we need to do a whole segment on tower safety because I don't think there's enough of it for amateur radio operators on the air.
Oh yeah, that's probably true. I mean, I think lots of people, most of us, almost all of us, there's not really there's a book or two out there. K7LXC has a book, I think, and there's some knowledge that can be had. There's a column in the NCJ about doing tower work, I think, a little bit. There's been some articles here and there in QST, but there's probably not enough of that. Almost everybody I know, we've all learned this sort of on the job training. So, and some people more on the job than others in the sense that they didn't even have anybody to tell them, where to start.
Well, just recently I discovered there's a website in an organization that tracks tower climbing accidents, especially those that involve, fatalities. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes page as well. But it's very insightful because tower climbing accidents are relatively rare on the one hand. On the other hand, the guys that bite the dust are the ones with the most experience. They slip, they miss, or they didn't clip on when they should have.
Yep.
Anyway, that's an interesting discussion, and I'm glad we had it. But ultimately, it led you to building your own superstation, isn't that right?
It did. It was interesting. At W5KFT, I spent because Lubbock's so far away. The ranch. Brian's mother, who was a retired home economics professor from Texas Tech University, she lived at the ranch by herself with her dog, although she said she didn't like calling it a ranch because it wasn't all that big. It was only 2,500 acres, and this in West Texas, that's kind of an embarrassment. That's like not even really land, because people have like 10,000, 20,000 acres, but it was 2,500 acres on the edge of a lake, and we only, because of the family constraints and various other constraints, we could only use a few acres of this to build a radio station. But we ended up putting up, what did we put up? We put up a 6-meter tower, 1, 2, 3, 4. I guess we ended up with 5 towers ultimately. 2 big ones and a couple of small ones. But as a result, I spent a lot of time there doing a lot of the groundwork, feed lines and control cables and wiring up the inside of the station. And I spent a lot of time doing that by myself. And I learned a lot. I also learned that I actually enjoyed that part of it. It was fun. It was fun to sort of do the integration and make it all work and put all the coax connectors on and hook up all the rotor cables and all that stuff was interesting. And trying to figure out how to do all of that stuff to achieve our goals was with some limits on the budget. It wasn't an unlimited budget, so there were things that we had to figure out how to do. Either because we had some improvised connectors on coax, or because we didn't have all the fancy switching or computer switching. So, how do you solve those problems when you want to do multiple radio contesting and things like that? So it was great fun, and I enjoyed doing that. But ultimately, wanting to have my own station, either because I'd like to get on the air casually, not have to drive an hour and a half, but also just not having to drive somewhere. Although I'm sort of back in that situation now because I don't live at my station. I'm at my station tonight, but I did a contest this weekend. But being a guest operator for so many years is a very interesting thing because you end up having these bags and boxes of things that you have to take back and forth. Especially if you operate from multiple different places, there's things you have to drag around, or make sure that you have, or whatever. But not only that, even if you get to leave the radios there, you have to round up food for the weekend, and you have to, bring clothes, and it's all this stuff that, and if you forget your tools, or you forget this or that, it's at home and it's not here. And so that's always a problem. But So that was part of it. Part of it was also wanting to have more control over, which contests I can operate, because if Brian is interested in certain contests, that means that either he operates them or we do a multi-op for that contest, and I don't get to do a single op. And over the years, I wanted to do a lot more single op DX contests, and so that was the other reason for wanting to build my own station, was to have more control over those things.
So what's in your station now?
What do you mean by that?
What's the operating position look like?
Well, I do primarily single operator 2 radio stuff. So I have a computer screen, and then I have 2 radios, 2 amplifiers, rotator controllers, 2 band scopes, 2 watt meters. Lots of 2s of everything. We also do multi-operator events from here, although we only do 2 radio. I only ever have 2 radios, so we end up moving one of the radios from the 2 radio position over sort of a slot in the desk, so that we're not sitting on top of each other, and then we use all the controls and everything. The only thing I have to move is the radio.
What's your radio of choice?
Well, right now on my station, and for quite a number of years, I have a pair of Elecraft K3 radios. I will tell you that I don't own those radios. A friend of mine who does not have a station, K5 Oscar Tango, who is more of a CW operator than I am, so he does a lot of the CW contests, either single op or sometimes we do multi-ops as CW. He actually owns the radios. He owns the P3s that are hooked up. So we have the K3 and we have a P3 for each radio. They're his radios. For a lot of years, at this station, I had a pair of TS-850s, and I used those for a long, long time. In fact, I still have some 850s that I need to sell. I keep saying I need to sell them. I need to get on that. But that's the radio I'm using. I have 2 AL1500 amplifiers, Ameritron AL1500 amplifiers, single 8877 tubes. I like a lot. I also do a lot of VHF UHF contesting, and it interfaces really, really well on the VHF UHF bands to the transverters. Better than anything that I've ever had. It does that stuff really well. It displays the right frequency on the radio. It displays the right frequency to the logging program. Even though it's on 10 meters, it tells the logging program that it's on 1296, and the dial says 1296, and that's kind of cool. The 850 was a great radio. In fact, the first couple of times I used a K3, I used it next to a TS-850 because I only borrowed one K3 from somebody. And the first time I did a contest that way, my reaction was, that 850 is not a bad radio. In fact, I would not hesitate operating a serious contest with a TS-850 today. I don't feel like I'd be at a serious disadvantage. I will say that of all the radios I've ever used so far, and there's radios I haven't used, but I've used quite a few radios. I haven't used some of the later, fancier ICOMs. But the K3 does something on sideband that the only other radio that I saw that did this really well was a FT1000D, the old FT1000D radio, and that's that at like 2 kilohertz 2 kilohertz filters actually work on sideband. And I can sit here at 2 kilohertz all weekend on sideband, and I could never ever figure out. I tried all kinds of filters in the 850, and I never could get. I could use the bandwidth controls, but I could never put crystal filters in it that were narrow, and so that was always kind of a hindrance. I could never get the kind of filtering I'd gotten with one. I used a FT1000D one time in a sweepstakes contest at W5KFT. He had one for like a few months, and I was very impressed with that radio at 2 kilohertz. The 2 kilohertz filter in it on sideband was amazing. If K5OT wasn't so kind to leave his radios here all the time, since he has no other place for them, I probably would have a pair of TS590s, to be perfectly honest, because I'm not sure I'd be willing to spend, as much money as a K3 costs. Although I have to say that the transverter interfacing might make me do that.
Well, I was having a conversation with somebody yesterday who's was saying that the ICOM 7300 has kind of changed the whole game in terms of entry level and pricing and stuff. So maybe we're going to see a lot of these other radios kind of drop in price, as a result of being positioned against ICOM's 7300.
Yeah, I guess that's a popular radio. I've seen exactly one. I think I touched it at Field Day last year, but I've not gotten to use one of those radios yet. But that, I hear good things about it. It used to be that I got to use lots of different radios at N5AU. In the early days of N5AU, N5AU was running a ham radio store in Dallas. He was a Yaesu dealer, so I got to use a number of different brand new Yaesu radios at the time. FT102 was one of them that came out while we were there, and FT1. We had one of those for a while. Things like that. So it was interesting using radios that I had no personal connection in. One of the things I learned from my father, being he was in the retail stereo business, was that when people shell out money for things, they're not most people have trouble criticizing their purchases, no matter how bad it is. And so if you spend $10,000 on a radio, by God, that's the best radio in the world, even if it's not. And so being able to use radios when you don't own them, it can be very enlightening. Because I remember when we got the FT1, it was like a really expensive radio from Yaesu at the time, and it had a number of issues, and it was not as good in a number of ways. It was not as good as the FT107s that we were using everywhere. So it was like, yeah, I don't want one of those radios, but
Did I read someplace that you're remotely controlling your station?
I am not.
Okay.
I've thought about doing that. I've not had decent internet out here until recently. It's a radio link, 5 mile. Well, it's more than that. It's several hops of radio to get here, Wi-Fi, to give me internet here. It's a commercial company that provides us, and it would probably work, but I've never bothered. My biggest deal is we get lots of thunderstorms year round. When I'm not here, everything's disconnected. I have a big table. I have an 8-foot table here with all the radios on it. When I leave here, nothing's plugged into the wall. There's not a single wire that goes to this table. All the coaxes, all the control cables, everything ends at the wall. And I unplug everything because anything that's connected is a path. Whether it's a ground wire or anything else, it will just destroy all kinds of stuff.
And you get some pretty good storms out there.
Yeah, we do. Currently the house here. I built a 2-car garage that also has a 17 by 17 room and a bath, a shower, and a closet, and that's the radio room. And it's part of the building that's a 2-car garage, and it's 20 feet from the house. I used to live here. I lived here for 10 years. When the kids got old enough, we moved back into town, and I found somebody who was going to build a house across the street. They were clearing some land, and I said, "Would you like to live closer to that house you're building?" And they said, "That would be great." And they've been my renters ever since. They haven't built their house yet, so. But I'm happy. I'm happy that they're renting, and there's people here all the time. So I get to come out here and use the radio part of the stuff. It has allowed me to keep my station.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA30N, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. You're not just an HF contester, but you're also a VHF, UHF contester. You just alluded to that. Are contests above 50 megahertz different in the way that they're conducted from HF contests?
Well, they are different in the way they're conducted, and currently, even recently, I guess, with some rule changes with the ARRL contests, even more different. In a sense, over the years, I didn't get into the VHF, UHF contesting until I got interested. Well, I was always interested in 6 meters at least, and even 2 meters to some extent. When I was first in the hobby, I remember, I really wanted to get on 6 meters. I thought that would be really cool. Maybe it was just I don't know anybody, and nobody has a radio for that band. And at the time, the HF radios didn't have 6 meters on them. And in fact, that's been a very recent development that's changed the world on 6 meters from a contesting perspective, and probably from a DXing perspective too, is that everybody has a radio now that does 6 meters. But in the 70s and 80s, that just didn't exist. You could go buy single band radios, but they were expensive, and so it was kind of a problem. But I always wanted to get on 6 meters. So a friend of mine, who was a couple years older than me, he bought I was still in high school. He bought an IC 502, which ICOM made these portable radios, a 502 and a 202 or 201 and a 402. I think this was a 202 and a 402, and they were single sideband radios for 6 meters, 2 meters, and 432. And they could be battery operated. They only ran like 3 watts, but man, I wanted one of those so bad. Anyway, he bought a 502, and we worked stuff on it. I worked E-skip. I worked E-skip from my front yard it had a built-in whip antenna and 3 watts, and I talked to some people on E-skip, across the United States, and that was just way cool. Unfortunately, at the time, in the late 70s, I guess it was the late 70s, early 80s, even the 3 watts from that thing destroyed the neighbor's TV set, which it's beyond reason how that could even be possible, but it did. And I think he was even on cable, but it just was like, it just didn't work. I mean, I was astounded. I mean, my father went over there and I transmitted, and he goes, "Oh yeah, it's like the picture goes away." And I'm like, what? Of course, that didn't happen to our Sony TV set, but his whatever, big console thing just rolled over and died with 3 watts on 6 meters. So that was the end of my 6 meter career. But I always wanted to do those bands, and I had a friend who was coming down and operating 160 with us, doing the 160 part of the DX contest with us, WA0TKJ, and he was operating from a station in Kansas where he lived. WB0DRLs, and he invited me to come up and operate on 6 meters. We at N5AU we had a 6 meter radio, 6 meter and a 2 meter radio. We didn't have an antenna for 2 meters that was horizontal, but we had a 6 meter beam, and we could work stuff on 6 meters, and we did some of that. But anyway, I went to WB0DRL where they were doing serious VHF contesting, and I went for 3 June contests. I drove to Kansas and operated the 6 meter part of the contest for them. And that was great fun. And I met some interesting people that I still know today. And I learned a lot about VHF contesting and UHF contesting with that. And then when I built W5KFT, Brian was somewhat interested. I had acquired various bits of equipment. I was doing some VHF rovering stuff because I didn't have a station. I did a few rovering efforts before there was a rover category, and put antennas on my car, Yagis on my car, and drove around and activated grid squares, and had a great time doing that. And so when we did KFT, I said, I want to do some VHF contests. So we got geared up for that, and W5KFT rounded up. He rounded up an 8877 amplifier, a 1500 watt amplifier for 6 meters, and he rounded up one for 2 meters. And we got a 400 watt amp for 222, and a kilowatt or 600 watt amp for 432, and we put up things and got on the air, and we had a lot of fun. We did really well from there in the June VHF contest. The The main focus of my deal has been the June VHF contest, mainly 6 meters. Although lately I've been doing some of the other contests throughout the calendar, especially since as I've been adding bands. I kept saying I would never go, well, I'm not going to add those bands, but now I'm on 6.2, 222, 432, 1296. Oh, I've missed one. 902, 1296. And so 900 megahertz is one of the most recent ones, but I added 900 megahertz and I also added 10 gigahertz at the same time. So I'm now on 10 gigahertz. And I always wanted to play around on 10 gigahertz, but it's been crazy. 10 gigahertz is a crazy band. So I have 2 watts and a 2-foot dish, and I've worked people a couple 100 miles away, and it just blows my mind.
Again, I'll ask the question. And that is, do you operate these contests any differently on those bands than you would in the HF band?
Yeah, I got distracted, I guess, a little bit. Well, no, actually, I would say yes and no. So, for me, from a contesting perspective, there's no difference. If I do a single op VHF contest here, I use 2 radios, just like it's an HF contest. The way I do it is I put 6 meters, because in the June contest, 6 meters is going to be hopefully the busy band. So I need one radio on 6 meters the whole time. So I put 6 meters on one radio, and I put all the other bands on the other radio. Essentially, I'm on 2 meters and 6 meters most of the time, and then I'm on the other bands as I move stations through those bands. But I can go listen on any band, on the other radio, and follow a rover around, or just follow people moving through the bands and make quick contacts while I'm running guys on 6 meters. So it's really not any different. I mean, you don't have the footprint, obviously, unless the band's open. 6 meters, but 6 meters, if 6 meters is open, it's like being on 10 meters. There's really, the way it feels to me is there's no difference. There are people out there in the VHF, UHF world that'll tell you, oh no, it's much different, and they want to make phone calls to set up contacts, and now that's allowed in the categories. Apparently, back in the old days, that was a real common thing, was to call everybody up on the phone and get them on the radio for skeds and stuff, even during a contest. And they'll tell you, oh, you got to do this. And in my experience, that's not true. Now, it's true. It does help you make contacts. If you know the guys there and you can coordinate the transmissions, and you both are, transmitting at the right times and pointing antennas at each other, it certainly makes the contacts a lot easier. But, it's really hard to work guys on 160. If you can call them on the phone or on the internet or get them on the chat page, because you see this happening even on 160, it makes it a lot easier to make those contacts. Fortunately, we still don't allow that in HF contests, but we do allow that in VHF, UHF contests. And so I have mixed feelings about it. I mean, it makes it easier. I've been through now a couple of contests where we can do this, and it makes it a lot easier to work these guys. If I can send a text message to the rover and ask him where he is, and stuff like that, it makes my life a lot easier than having to wait for him to show up on 2 meters. My experience has been that there's really no difference between the VHF world and the HF world. Sure, yeah, you got to point antennas at people, but I don't have any trouble making random contacts. Just like on HF, I mean, the real trick is to make noise. And so if people are calling CQ and moving their antennas around, they're going to make contacts with each other. And if they're smart and know that, there's a station in that grid square who's got these bands and he's got enough power and he actually knows how to operate, that, once I get his attention on 2 meters, we can work on all the bands. That's usually the ticket. And that's how it works. And once you get the guy on 2 meters, then you're pointed at him, and then it's just a matter of going through the other bands and hoping you can work him on all the other bands. And if the guy knows what he's doing, you can work them. And I can work people with no conditions out to like 500 miles on 2 meters, and the dead of winter at night. And so it was interesting. So I went to when I was going to WB0 DRLs, this was a very enlightening moment for me, I guess. I went to WB0 DRLs in Kansas for a VHF contest the second time I went. And there's this guy, Lauren Libby. He's W0LD now. And he works in the he installs shortwave radio stations for Christian broadcasting. And he had built a pair of 10 gigahertz radios that at the time they looked magical. I mean, they were like, plumbing or something. It was crazy. But he brought them into the shack and he set them down on Friday after driving in from Colorado. And he goes, I guarantee these things for 65 miles and not a foot further. And that kind of stuck with me. And we were having lunch later or dinner or something. And I said, so you said that when you brought those radios in. Can you explain that? And he said, well, that's what I mean. He goes, it's basically just physics here. It's like, got this much power, this much antenna gain, this is what they'll do. And I said, well, it's interesting. I said, so you're telling me that if I run more power and more antenna gain, I could talk further on these bands? And he goes, oh, absolutely. And I said, well, how far? And he said, how much power you want to run? How much antenna gain you got? He goes, it's just a matter of power and antenna gain. And it turns out that on these bands, troposcatter is all about power and antenna gain. And he told me, he says, yeah, the U.S. government runs these circuits. They run them on like 400 megahertz. And they're 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, circuits that don't rely on propagation or satellites. And they do it with troposcatter. And they just run a lot of power. And he goes, they're solid circuits. And because they're not affected by propagation, and they're not affected by, reflecting objects being in place or having satellites, they're independent and reliable in that sense. And he said, but he says, it's just a matter of you just need to run enough power and enough gain. And so that's really stuck with me. And so, once you know that, it's like, oh, well, if I want to do this, I just need to get more antenna up there and run as much power as I can legally run. And, that's going to improve my chance of making these contacts. But as far as the operating part, it never feels any different to me. There are less people to work and it's slower and things like that. But, I've done 10-meter contests at the bottom of the solar cycle. I called C in a 10-meter contest for the entire day on Saturday and made 10 contacts, or on Sunday and made 10 contacts, or maybe less than 10 contacts. But I've also done 6 meters and made almost 1,900 contacts in the June VHF contest as a single op. So that's better than I've done in a lot of 10-meter contests. That's better than I've done in most sweepstakes contests. So no, it's not any different.
George, if you remember, I had a lengthy conversation with Brooke Allen, N2BA, in episode 127 of the QSO Today podcast about the flow state that one might enter when doing a contest. What do you think about that?
Well, what he talks about is very interesting, and I can go on about some of those aspects of the thing as far as operating. One of the things that happens is as you practice this, you get better at it, and you get into that. And I'm fascinated by the whole thing about the flow state, because definitely achieving that. But the other thing that's happened is there's a number of operating things that I find fascinating. The DXpedition was very enlightening in this area, but one of the things that's happened to me here is that I've gotten to the point now where all of my stuff I don't have to think about doing it anymore. I don't have to think about the radios. I don't have to think about the logging program. I don't have to think about the antenna switching. It's all second nature, okay? And so what's interesting is the radios almost vanish. And it's not the whole contest that this happens, but there are periods that last a long time where the radios, it's as if I'm connected to the voices on the other end. That the radios aren't there anymore. They're not conscious to me. I'm making contacts and I'm logging them, but the logging part and the radios, other than looking at the characters on the screen, the voices are coming to my head, and we're exchanging information, but the mechanics of it sort of disappear. And it's fascinating when that happens. It's also it's very satisfying when it works really well and everything's going well. And then what's interesting is when you get to that point in contesting, then you can focus on all kinds of other stuff. You can focus on all kinds of little things to try to make more contacts. Because there's a lot of little things that people don't realize. They don't realize necessarily why people are making certain choices when they're doing a contest, and it's amazing. So I have a guest operator who comes here, and he operates the ARRL 10-meter contest, and he's operated every one of them here since I built the station in 2001. And he had some experience before, and he's gotten to operate lots of other contests here and other places. But it's been interesting watching him progress, because the first few years he was here, I couldn't talk to him while he was doing the contest. I mean, it would disrupt him. He'd have to take the headphones off and like pay attention to me. I'd been doing it long enough at this point that that didn't make any sense to me. But the other thing is, even he didn't have enough bandwidth to even think about turning antennas. It's like that was like too much. And as the years went by, he's gotten better at all that and stuff. And so it's been interesting watching that progress. And when I look back on that in my own stuff, obviously it's true of anything that you do. But as you get more practice, all those things change. And so I find that all endlessly fascinating. So his talk about all the gaming and stuff like that was fascinating.
You mentioned in the pre-show discussion that you've done a number of DXpeditions. What have you done, and what was the most exotic?
Well, the most exotic, I guess, or the most serious thing was I got invited to go on a trip to South Georgia Island and South Sandwich Islands, to southern Thule and the South Sandwich Islands. So South Georgia is about 600 miles southeast of the Falkland Islands, and southern Thule is like another 600 plus miles to the southeast of that, and the Southern Ocean. And that was that was one of those trips where you go somewhere that's like nobody's going to come and help you, and we're really a long way off the map, and there's nobody living there. It was a serious DXpedition in that sense. It was also a trip that was interesting in some other ways. They decided early on to not take on any sponsors other than the Northern California DX Foundation, and so we all, there was no rig sponsorship, there was no antenna sponsorship. We didn't have to wear any hats and take pictures. We also didn't have to answer to anybody about any of that stuff. We got to choose radios based on what we wanted to achieve. So I think that was pretty cool that they did that. So I was happy about that. The other thing is they called it the microlight thing. It was the first one in that, and we tried to have because we could only be on southern Thule, we could only get a permit for 4 days. And there were some stipulations about all that. The previous DXpedition that had gone 10 years before had a lot of difficulty and had tents blown apart, and the boat left them, and it was pretty bad for a few days. And so there was lots of things around the permit to land. I think that the government was somewhat reluctant to, let those silly hams go there and try to die. But our trip turned out fine. It was, but as a result, we tried to make it so that we didn't have a lot of things, having lots and lots of stuff and huge generators and trying to take amplifiers onto the island and all that stuff would have just made that very, very hard and difficult for the 4 days. So to try to maximize operating time, we used simple antennas and low power and limited our band selection. I'm sure that people were unhappy with that, but having been there, I can say that was absolutely the right choice. I don't think that, given our limited amount of stay and stuff, that trying to do the other bands would have caused huge amounts of headaches and trouble and probably would have kept us from operating.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
Well, I mean, the technology stuff is very interesting. And I guess from that, I mean, like SDRs and digital modes that are happening, and some of that stuff's is pretty cool and very interesting. I think the SDR technology is kind of interesting. I'm fascinated by the fact that you can sort of have these chips and some computer code and do radio things. I only own one SDR. I own a simple little receiver that I play with. I use it probably more as a spectrum analyzer and things like that than anything else. It's also useful for sort of checking stuff. But it's still fascinating to me that you can do that. And I think that's pretty cool. I obviously we're going to see more and more of that because, it makes sense. It makes it easy to make radios do cool things and also make them upgradable and probably make radios better in the long run.
George, what advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
Get on and operate. And also try everything. One of the things that's interesting to me about ham radio is that it's a huge hobby, and there's so many different aspects of it. And a lot of hams, I don't think, fully appreciate that, or they get stuck in one little area and they haven't even tried anything. And so I've always made a point of trying to at least experience some of these things, whether it's, I think there's very little of ham radio that I haven't done in some way or another. And by that I mean, I've built kits, I've done QRP and maybe even still do QRP. There's contesting, there's DXing, there's rag chewing, which I still do. I love getting on the air and talking to people still. VHF, UHF. I've been on FM. I've done transmitter hunts. I've done ADRF stuff. I've operated slow scan. I've operated digital modes and teletype. I've made digital meteor scatter contacts. I've made. I don't think I've made a digital moon bounce contacts, but I've made non-digital moon bounce contacts in various forms over the years. I've done satellites. I don't know if there's much that I've sort of not at least exposed myself to, even if it's for a limited amount of time. And so I think it's probably good to do that because not only might it keep your interest up, but, you'll probably find the thing that clicks with you. For me, it's always been operating. In any form of the operating. But the contests have been great because it sort of concentrates the operating and gives a purpose to it. And the competitive part I like. But there's a lot more to it than just the operating. I mean, the building the station, once you get to build your own station or build a station and then or make changes to it and see if that improves the scores, that's very cool. Sort of getting to see the whole process is lots of fun. So, but I think that's the biggest thing is go experience it all. One of the things that I think is really cool is that we have people, even though there's no requirement anymore, we have people learning the Morse code, which just astounds me since that's been one of my biggest stumbling blocks over the years.
What's your favorite ham radio convention?
My favorite ham radio convention? Well, I've been to Dayton many times over the years. I think the first time I went to Dayton, I was still in high school, and I talked to my parents into letting me go. And in 1981, and that's interesting. I've also been to Visalia a number of times in the recent years, and Visalia is also an interesting trip. The big state convention here in Texas, unfortunately, got moved one weekend about 20 years ago. It got moved to the weekend of the June VHF contest. So as a result, I haven't been to that convention since because the June VHF contest, I missed one June VHF contest one year, and it happened to be a year where the conditions were really, really good, and they had incredible amounts of E-skip on 2 meters, and like it lasted for hours and hours and hours, and they worked Japan on 6 meters and stuff, and after that contest was over and I heard all that, I said, well, I'm not going to miss another one of these. So, but Dayton and Visalia have been the ones that sort of the big conventions that I've gone to that, certainly have been most interesting from the aspect of getting to see all of these contesters that I've met over the years. And so you sort of get to complete that deal of getting to meet these people in person.
Right, put a face with a call sign.
Yeah.
George, I want to thank you so much for joining me on QSO today. It was a lot of fun, and I'm really actually happy that we had the little talk about tower safety. So I want to thank you for coming on QSO today and wish you 73.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. 73.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with George. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in K5TR in the search box at the top of the page. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing on the subscribe buttons on the show notes page. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages. Your value for value support is recognized on the QSO Today podcast and in the weekly show notes. Use our Amazon link when you shop on Amazon. Clicking on this link before you enter Amazon will allow Amazon to pay us a small commission on what you purchase. This is a very painless way to support the QSO Today podcast. QSO Today is syndicated on every podcast platform, including Spotify and the iTunes Store. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.